Binaural beats. What are they? How does your brain perceive them? And can they, as some people have claimed, put you into an altered mindset like a digital drug? Hi, I'm Dr. Ryan Pevey. I have a PhD in neuroscience, and today I want to talk to you about this binaural beats phenomenon. And spoiler alert, no, they probably can't get you high, but they might be useful for other things. Binaural beats are a really interesting phenomenon where one sound, a pure tone, is played into one of your ears, and then another pure tone is played into your other ear, and then your brain creates a third ghost tone that doesn't really exist. Here, let's try it out, but use headphones for the best effect. Do you hear that? Two tones, one in each ear, and a third ghost tone that, like I said, doesn't exist. This is a binaural beat. But what are binaural beats, and why do I keep saying that third tone doesn't exist? They're an example of what's called an auditory illusion. You know what illusions are. Well, visual illusions anyway, otherwise called optical illusions. Look, here I've created a few famous examples of optical illusions that you're probably already familiar with. This first one is maybe the most famous optical illusion there is. It's called a Rubin's vase. You know the deal here. Depending on whether you're focusing on the white spaces or the black spaces, this might look like two faces looking at each other or a single vase in the center. This next one is called a Ponzo illusion, where converging lines trick our brains into perceiving depth in the image, that in turn makes these yellow bands in the video appear to be different sizes when in fact they're the same size. The orange circles in this Ebbinghaus or Titchener circles illusion are the same size as well, but our brains tend to perceive the circle on the left as smaller because our visual cortex incorrectly interprets the blue circles as containing useful context about the size of the orange circles, but they don't. I'm also just really pleased with the animation that I created for this. This last one is called a Hermann grid, and you probably see faint ghostly circles or balls appearing in the periphery of your vision at the intersection of the gray lines. If you move your eyes around the screen, you'll probably see those ghost circles fade in and out around the grid. There's an even more striking variant of the Hermann grid that has white dots at each of the intersections. This is called a scintillating grid, and the dots appear to flicker or scintillate in your visual periphery instead. This one has a much stronger effect on my vision than the Hermann grid, and funnily enough, they work because of completely different and independent mechanisms in your brain. These optical illusions were, honest to goodness, really fun to create, so if you enjoyed them, let me know in the comments, and I'll make an entire video about them. The thing about illusions, though, is that not only can you tell that they're just inherently interesting, judging by the obscene amount of optical illusion content that you can find online, but they're also a really interesting model for sensory neuroscience. There are whole research projects and academic labs centered around studying sensory illusions and what they can tell us about how the brain works. For example, the Hermann grid that I mentioned before works because of a phenomenon that happens in your retina called lateral inhibition, where activated neurons in your retina inhibit the activity of the neurons adjacent to them. Which is why you see the dark spots at the intersections, because those spots on your retina essentially have inhibition coming from two different directions, both horizontally and vertically. But illusions don't stop at vision. Like I said, those are all optical illusions, but an illusion in a neuroscientific sense is just your brain misinterpreting the information coming in from your senses. And in the case of these optical illusions, it's just your brain misinterpreting the information that's coming in through your sense of vision. But there's no reason that illusions only occur with vision. Your brain can make mistakes with every sense that you have: sight, smell, touch, taste, and yes, even your hearing. For example, here's a well-known one called the McGurk effect, where your brain is interpreting the sound of my voice based on what the shape of my mouth looks like. Ga ga ga, 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 ga ga ga. So when you see video of my mouth saying ba 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 with a B, you hear that sound. But when you see video of my mouth saying ga 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 with a G, you hear that sound, even though it's the exact same audio in both clips. The audio here was actually me making the ba sound with a B in both clips. And for those of you that said, I could tell it was the B the whole time, sorry, you're actually wrong. It was actually me making the ga sound with a G. Or was it? Okay, so the McGurk effect isn't purely an auditory illusion. Because it's relying on input from both the auditory and visual system, it's an audio-visual illusion. But still, it makes the point that you can have an illusion of any sensory system, not just visual. So now let's get back to talking about binaural beats and consider a purely auditory illusion. This is pure sine wave tone, a sound wave which has a frequency of 220 Hz, or 220 oscillations per second, which corresponds to an A note for all you music people out there. People with normal hearing can often hear anywhere between 20 Hz and 20,000 Hz, so this pure tone could be 100 Hz or 2000 Hz, for example. So next, let's construct a binaural beat. And genuinely, this only works if you have headphones because of the isolation that you can get between each ear individually. So if you got them, use them. Anyway, how you construct a binaural beat is first you need two ears connected to a brain, generously provided by you in this case. I thank you. Then I'll pipe one pure tone into one of your ears, and I'll pipe another slightly different frequency into your other ear. And if you pay attention closely, you'll probably hear that third tone. Do you hear that? But that third tone, and I cannot stress this enough, is not real. I'm not tricking you by pumping a third tone into the audio feed. You can double check me if you are wearing headphones by taking off one of your headphones and then listening to the other ear. And you'll find that when you're only listening to one earpiece, you'll only hear one tone. And it's only when you're listening to both earpieces that you hear that third tone. Let's explore this a little deeper. I wrote this little app in Python that can generate these tones on my computer, but I've also put the whole repository on GitHub if you're interested in downloading my sloppy code and using it yourself, link in the description. But if we open this up in console, you can see the directions for all the parameters that we can control. First of all, we can swap the left and right ears. And you'll notice that that doesn't make a big difference. Maybe if you have a lateralized hearing issue that affects one ear over the other, that might affect things. I mainly just wanted to include that for completeness. Most importantly, you can control what's called the carrier tone in the literature, which is just the deeper tone measured in hertz, and we can control this either in big steps of 10 hertz each or small steps of 1 hertz. Then we can also change the offset tone, which is the higher frequency. But note that the way this parameter works, like the name suggests, is that you're setting this to a frequency offset from the carrier tone. So if the carrier frequency is set to 250 Hz and the offset is at 6 Hz, then the actual offset frequency is 256 Hz. Make sense? And again, we can make big and small steps here. As we update these parameters, the user interface changes accordingly. If you look down here, I've limited the range in this software for both carrier and offset frequencies. So the carrier frequency can be anywhere between 10 Hz and 1200 Hz, while the offset can be anywhere between half a Hz and 40 Hz. These limits are based on physiology, where the average human can't hear anything below like 15 to 20 Hz, so I set the absolute bottom of the carrier tone a little bit lower at 10 Hz. But on the high end, the phenomenon breaks down for most people above about 1100 Hz, and we'll get to why that is in a few minutes. Then on the offset tone, the top and bottom of the range are dictated by the range of frequencies that the binaural beats normally break down at for people. So people generally don't perceive a beat at above or below this range of offset frequencies. And again, we'll come back to that because it's caused by some really interesting brain science. Then just some standard housekeeping and presets that you can cycle through. Each of these presets are related to common EEG waveforms and are relevant to the way that binaural beats are used by a lot of people for various purposes related to concentration or studying. But you can cycle through these with hotkeys instead of having to set them manually with the main controls. After that, I have some controls related to visualizations and overlays. That's right, built-in data visualizations. I know you're just as excited as I am, so let's launch the app again, but with a waveform viz tag, which generates this simple waveform graph. Each line represents the tone supplied to each ear. The left ear is the purple waveform, the right ear is this respectable green. The higher frequencies are hard to see in this graph if you just plot them directly, so I scaled the timeline axis along the bottom by a factor of about 30 using a speed sweep or time-based parameter. This is kind of like filming in slow motion so that you can see the detail of fast-moving objects. You can see that if I hit the spacebar, the tones swap back and forth between the ears in line with the audio feed. I can increase or decrease the carrier and offset frequencies. And you can hear the characteristics of the binaural beat change along with it. But what about the binaural beat? Remember, it's an illusion. It's a construction of your brain. This figure so far is only showing the pure tones, the real ones, but the beat is made by a known predictable mechanism, a pretty simple one too. The beat is defined precisely by the offset value. So we can easily plot what it would be if it were real, and if you hit the B button, B for beat, then it does just that. It plots a waveform of the binaural beat, and you can see that the peaks and troughs of the binaural beats waveform line up with the moments where the peaks and troughs of the two pure tones line up. I also have simulated and data-derived spectrogram visualizations on here too, if you're into that kind of thing. If we crank this way up, then you'll see how wild and crazy this thing goes. Actually, when we get all the way up to the top, it looks pretty nice too. Now that's how you make a binaural beat, but next let's talk about how your brain perceives a binaural beat. There's some key anatomy that you need to understand here. So I've created this model of a human hearing apparatus. I generated this brain model from real medical imaging data with 1mm spatial resolution, but pretend that this is your brain for the purposes of this video. We'll track the pathway of an auditory input signal as it travels through your hearing apparatus. First, your ear has to sense the actual sound, so it travels through the pinna of your ear and ear canal, hitting your eardrum, which vibrates and sloshes fluid around inside the cochlea of your inner ear. That's this part shaped like a snail shell here. The cochlea is incredibly sensitive to a wide range of sounds. When I said earlier that the normal range of human hearing is between 20 Hz and 20,000 Hz, this is the part of your ear that does that sensation. It's got that spiral shape partly because lower, deeper frequency sounds can bend around a corner better, so they travel round and around up the spiral shape and hit the sensory neurons at the very end, while higher pitched sounds don't bend around corners as well, so they stimulate the sensory neurons closer to the base. The signals from the sensory neurons in the cochlea coalesce in the auditory nerve, which travels up to the brainstem connecting at the pons. The superior olivary complex in the pons is the critical structure for this whole phenomenon, and it is the region of your brain where the binaural beat actually comes from. 2 sounds go in and 3 sounds come out. And if you only know one thing about this brain region for the purposes of this video, it should be that this brain region is a coincidence detector for sound. It does this by taking in signals from the auditory nerves from both ears and compares the timing of their arrival, producing exquisite temporal precision. I'm talking precision on the order of tens of microseconds. This is part of how your brain is able to localize the source of a sound in 3D space around us, and we'll come back to that in a second because it's key to understanding how this phenomenon works. The next important area of the auditory system is the medial geniculate nucleus of the thalamus. The thalamus is often given pretty short shrift for merely being a filter or relay to the neocortex, which isn't untrue per se, but isn't giving enough credit to the thalamus for the extra processing and modulation of the signal on the way there. It picks out the important signals from the background noise and both feeds that signal upwards to the neocortex while also receiving feedback from the neocortex to coordinate that attentional focus. After that is the neocortex. This is the level at which you become consciously aware of the signals. Everything before this is bubbling away in your subconsciousness. There are only 2 primary regions that I'm going to highlight here, the first being the primary auditory cortex, also known as A1, in the transverse temporal gyrus. This area is the first region that processes auditory signals in the neocortex. It's processing the most basic aspects of the sounds coming in: frequency, timing, changing features in the signal profile. It represents the binaural beat as a distinct perceptual object here. It's not computing it from scratch. As far as this region of your brain is concerned, the binaural beat exists just as much as the carrier and offset tones. There are 3 distinct percepts here, not 2. Next is the secondary auditory cortex and the superior temporal gyrus. This region sits above A1 in the processing hierarchy, so it's taking input from A1 and processing it even more before passing it higher up the chain of consciousness. This area is responsible for interpreting the signal further and contributes to that subjective experience of the beat pulsing, and its internalized location where some people report that it's coming from within their own head. Okay, so we've got a good non-comprehensive list of parts of the auditory system. Now let's move on to how does the system work normally. When a sound wave originates from directly in front of you, it hits both ears at the same time, and conduction through the pathway occurs at the same time, or coincidentally. This is relatively boring, but we need to understand how this works so we understand what happens next. Now let's consider what happens when a sound comes in from one side or another. In this example, the sound wave hits your right ear first and immediately begins signal transduction up the auditory nerve to the superior olivary complex. It takes roughly 5 milliseconds for the signal to propagate up the nerve to the neurons in the olivary complex. Meanwhile, the speed of sound at sea level is 342 meters per second, so the sound hits your other ear in about 1/3 of a millisecond and starts propagating up the left ear to the superior olivary complex, arriving almost at the same time, but not quite. This non-coincidence shows up as a phase shift in the neural signal, and these neurons can interpret that shift as a sound coming from the right. Isn't that crazy? This is one of the main mechanisms for how you can tell what direction any sound is coming from. And to put it simply, the ear that hears the sound first is the side that the sound comes from. Simple enough, right? But the apparatus required to do that when the speed of sound is more than 10 times faster than signal transduction through the nerve is a feat of evolutionary engineering that is worth spending some time to appreciate. This mechanism also breaks down at higher frequencies, above about 1100 Hz, because the peaks and troughs of the sound waves arrive too close to each other for the apparatus and the olivary to sense a signal offset. Above that, your brain discerns location more by relying on the attenuation of volume between ears, meaning how the sound is generally louder in the ear facing the sound, or the way that sound waves interact with the shape of your earlobes. That's why the binaural beat only works in that lower register of hearing, because this system evolved to find the location of lower pitch sounds, and it evolved a separate system to find the location of higher pitch sounds. Now let's consider what happens when we play two isolated tones with a small frequency offset for binaural beats. When we do this, we're hacking into this auditory system like a teenager keeping the lights on at Jurassic Park. The difference in frequency between the two tones means that the phase shift that the neurons are interpreting is constantly changing faster than the neurons can keep up with. And the integration of the signals in the neurons looks identical to a stimulus where you were genuinely hearing three distinct tones. So that is the signal that gets passed on to the subsequent parts of the pathway, and that is where the actual beat comes from. Another thing to consider if you understand the basics of wave interference as a physical phenomenon is you might be asking, what's the difference between binaural beats and just standard run-of-the-mill wave interference? When you have waves bouncing around inside of a fluid and they're interacting with each other constructively or destructively, what's the difference between that and this? The answer is you. You are the difference. You see, in wave interference, the waves are physically interacting with each other and is completely independent of you, and your ear is picking up on the interference pattern between the two different sounds. Both ears have essentially the same input, and importantly, the waves would interfere with each other whether you were there or not. It's a real bear in the woods kind of situation. But with binaural beats, the sound waves aren't interacting physically in any way, shape, or form. In other words, the interference pattern that you're hearing is entirely created by the physiology of your auditory system. That's what I mean when I say this is an illusion, because your brain is interpreting the sounds as if they're physically interacting when in fact they aren't. So your brain is misinterpreting the reality of the situation. And that misrepresentation is literally the definition of an illusion. In other words, the binaural beat was in you all along. Speaking of the beat being in you all along, a lot of people report that they hear the beat as if it's originating from inside their own head. Since the illusion is caused by a failure of the brain region associated with 3D sound localization, when that process fails, there's no localization information attached to that sound as it travels up your auditory pathway to A1 and A2. The A2 neocortical region specifically is involved in what's called the dorsal wear pathway, which is a network of neocortical regions that integrate information from multiple senses like sight, touch, and indeed hearing in order to create a higher order sense of 3D spatial awareness. But since this region isn't getting any 3D location information from this auditory stimulus, it has kind of two choices. Either the sound is coming from everywhere or it's coming from inside your own head. I suppose it could also be coming from nowhere, but the neocortex doesn't like that kind of ambiguity, so it seems to just pick one of the other two choices. And these are the kinds of subconscious processes that are always churning away in the background of your brain. You see, the neocortex as an organ is really trying to generate a model of the world around you that's consistent with your life experiences, so that it can predict what's going to happen next for your survival. But this kind of stimulus causes that process to just kind of throw its hands up in the air and just make a guess. Now, maybe that's kind of an uncomfortable thought for you, but the more you learn about brain function, the more you realize that a lot of the process of consciousness is just as squishy as the brain itself. One more point before we move on. The superior olivary complex region of the brain is incredibly evolutionarily ancient. It is a conserved structure across all mammals, meaning that all mammals have the same structure in our brains, and it works in more or less the same way. Not just all humans, all mammals. Your dog and your cat would probably hear the same thing if you popped your headphones on their heads. They would probably hear the binaural beats too. I don't think that I would have survived that experiment with my cat, so that remains a thought experiment for me, but if you decide to try that out, let me know. Meanwhile, birds have a similar structure that performs similar functions, but fate mapping experiments show that it develops from different tissue area in a bird embryo than it does in mammals. This means that the superior olivary complex likely evolved before the origin of mammals, but after our last common ancestor with birds, putting it anywhere between 125 and 300 million years old by my calculations, and potentially predating the mammalian neocortex entirely, which is going to be important later on. Now that we know how they're made, let's move on to what can they do for you. The main claimed benefits for binaural beats are reduced anxiety and stress, improved relaxation, better focus, concentration, deeper meditation, improved sleep, enhanced mood or creativity. Some people also claim gains in memory, cognitive flexibility, even pain relief, among other things. The main mechanism for all these effects is cited as entrainment of brainwaves in the neocortex. The brainwaves in question are EEG or electroencephalogram recordings. You've probably seen these EEG arrays before, where each spot on your scalp is an electrode. Each electrode can pick up on minuscule electrical charges that come from large amounts of neurons firing simultaneously in the spot directly underneath the electrode. So it's a measure of coordinated brain activity. And if you track this activity over time, you can see these waves across the brain. These brain waves are well documented and useful scientific tools that also have a characteristic frequency measured in hertz. The frequency of the dominant brain waves at any given time are correlated with different states of consciousness. For example, the slowest frequencies in the range of 1 to 4 hertz occurs during deep dreamless sleep. Here are the other frequency ranges and their associated states of consciousness or alertness. You might notice that the range of these brainwave frequencies is pretty much exactly the same range as the perception of binaural beats. It's about 1 to 40 hertz. So the story goes with this cortical entrainment idea that if you play the right binaural beats in certain frequency ranges, then you'll induce the neocortex in the same range of brainwave activity and thus the associated state of consciousness. For example, play 1 hertz beats and you'll get sleepy, but play 40 hertz beats and you'll supercharge your focus and ability to study, or make that quick turnaround deadline for this week's TPS report. From a scientific perspective, these are a lot of big claims for both physiological and health benefits. At the same time, users listening to binaural beats in the health and wellness space number in the millions. So the question is, do any of these claimed benefits actually stand up to scientific scrutiny? There are actually quite a few psychological studies on the effects of binaural beats, but as a scientist, I would describe a lot of them as fairly preliminary and with somewhat mixed results at this point, mostly pointing to further studies with larger sample sizes, but enough that we can start to look at the results in aggregate. The studies on anxiety and mood seem to offer the best support, with more than a dozen studies showing that binaural beats generally alleviated stress and depression symptoms better than silence or no audio placebo controls. But most of these studies don't use any other audio-based controls, things like music or pure audio tones on their own without the binaural offset. One study in particular, with a larger sample size of 291 ER patients, showed greater anxiety reduction from binaural beat audio compared to no sound or music controls on a self-reported scale. But self-reported data isn't considered as reliable as like clinician-rated surveys or more objective measures of anxiety like cortisol levels, for example. This happens a lot with these kinds of preliminary studies where the field is still working out the best practices for methods. I think the best study design would have a relatively large sample of at least several hundred individuals and include both self-reported results from patients but also more rigorous measures like cortisol or clinician-rated surveys. That ideal study would also include other audio-based controls like music or white noise or monaural beats where they play the two tones into both ears at the same time. Cognitive performance and attention research is more mixed. Some studies show that binaural beats improve measures of focus or reaction time on certain tasks, with one study showing that specifically gamma frequency beats mixed with white noise both improve performance on a vigilance task, but also that EEG recordings showed that patients did exhibit 40 Hz brainwave signatures, which they said confirmed entrainment. However, a large sample size study with 1,000 people found that they slightly lowered participants' performance, suggesting that the beats may be distracting or annoying, at least for some people. Another study showed that beats heard before an IQ test actually lowered scores slightly compared to a control group. So this distracting or annoying thing might actually be a pretty critical aspect of it, because some people do report that they aren't a big fan of the pure binaural beats, especially for any lengthy amount of time. And that may be why a lot of the apps out there also seem to overlay the tones with music or with white noise. So a big question is, can it actually drive entrainment in the neocortex? A 2023 review in PLOS ONE looked at the entrainment results in the literature and found that only 5 out of the 14 studies reported that EEG results were consistent with brainwave entrainment. 8 studies found contradictory or no entrainment, and 1 had mixed results. The review authors suggested that the inconsistency might be due to methodology differences, but they concluded it's not yet settled whether binaural stimulation can reliably drive brainwaves in a controllable way, and they cautioned that claims of psychological effects via brainwave synchronization should be considered with caution given the lack of consistent empirical support. Personally, this is the claim that I'm most skeptical of, and I'm not the only neuroscientist out there who feels that way. While I don't think that it's impossible, I'd need to see some pretty convincing evidence, and I just don't see that in the literature. Also, remember how I was talking about how evolutionarily ancient the superior olivary complex is, maybe even predating the neocortex entirely? Well, this whole system evolved to help animals find where a noise was coming from in the environment to find threats or resources for survival, not to set states of consciousness in a brain region that hadn't even evolved yet. Not to mention that the neocortex isn't some passive joystick getting yanked around by every input coming in. It developed by evolution to integrate information across all senses in order to determine the next course of action in survival situations. Last but not least of all, like I mentioned before, its usage is very widespread, on the order of millions of people. In a recent international survey of about 30,000 people, about 5% of respondents reported using binaural beats in order to alter their mental state. The primary motivations reported were to relax or fall asleep, to change your mood. A smaller subset even tried to simulate psychedelic effects with these sounds as some form of digital drug. So a lot of people are using binaural beats and reporting positive benefits regardless of the underlying neurophysiological mechanism. And it's non-invasive and safe. The main risk mentioned in the literature and frequently on the apps and websites with this content is the risk of seizure, called audiogenic seizure induction. As far as I can tell, binaural beats have never been documented to induce a seizure in humans unless maybe they had some kind of pre-existing seizure susceptibility. It has been seen in some animal models, but audiogenic seizure induction in humans seems to occur with extremely loud sounds or specific reflex epilepsy syndromes. Obviously, if you're concerned about this risk, consult your physician first. I'm a PhD doctor, not an MD doctor. So it has some documented benefits and some claim benefits where the jury is still out, but there are some claims that can be flat out rejected. So what can't binaural beats do? Well, they aren't curative for any condition. You can find people online that are claiming that it cures anything from ADHD to depression or even chronic pain, but even the best supported effects suggest a temporary alleviation of symptoms, which is legitimately useful, but it's not going to offer any permanent fix. And beware of anybody who might tell you otherwise, especially if it's in exchange for money. You can find people online suggesting that it can be used for all kinds of woo-woo uses, like astral projection or enhancing your psychic abilities. Obviously, at that point, it's getting way outside of the realm of the scientific, so I think it suffices to say that there isn't any evidence for that. In fact, binaural beats are so innocuous, the biggest risk associated with them, in my opinion, is falling for the pseudoscience claims associated with them. Oftentimes, these kinds of claims prey on the most vulnerable people amongst us, people that might be terminally ill, or psychologically fragile, desperate, or just plain gullible, and anybody with limited financial resources that spends money on a digital panacea or that delays or forgoes medical treatment for a real condition because some guru online told them that they've got an MP3 for that can suffer some real-world consequences for that misplaced faith. One of the criticisms out there is that the effects of binaural beats may be largely attributable to the placebo effect, which would explain a lot of the variability at small sample sizes, but the bigger, larger studies do seem to back up at least some of the more conservative claims. Even if it is largely placebo, that isn't meant to invalidate it. If it works, it works. And there is real and legitimate scientific research into using the placebo effect to induce positive outcomes for patients, with some really interesting results showing that even if you're aware that the effect is placebo, it still works. Another criticism is that maybe it's the same thing for all audio stimulation. Music therapy is widely documented as effective in basically all the exact same ways, and a lot of the studies that showed negative results for binaural beats were in comparison to music. A lot of the studies also highlight that pure binaural beats were too intense for participants, so they overlay the beats on top of music, as I've done here for a lot of this video as well. The same can be said for white noise and its variants like pink noise. In fact, I added a colored noise toggle on my Beats app from earlier in the video. There's also some interesting parallels between binaural beats and ASMR, or autonomous sensory meridian response, which has gained a lot of popularity online for a lot of similar uses.
ASMR. Whisper, whisper, whisper.
Speaking of ASMR, as I am myself somebody who is sensitive to the brain tingles from ASMR, there is frustratingly little in the scientific literature about it, but again, the anecdotal evidence is pretty undeniable. The term ASMR is the most searched term here on YouTube and has been for several years running. And again, users report similar motivations and results compared to binaural beats. By the way, if you're interested in an ASMR video similar to this one, let me know in the comments. I think there's probably a market on this platform for it. Since this is a system that evolved for sound localization, it got the scientist in me wondering whether there is a way that you can incorporate that into the experience and create a rotating the beat experiment. My hypothesis, if you could implement it correctly, is that the binaural beat would fade in and out but not rotate, whereas the two distinct beats would rotate around you, which would make for a kind of wild experience if true, I think. I got really excited about this, but the more I thought about it, the more I realized how much time and effort it would take for me to implement, because I think I would need to simulate the time delay for each ear introduced by the speed of sound for each beat, as well as the relative volume differences from lateralized stimuli. And I think to really make it work, you would also need to modify this, you would also need to model the slight modifications introduced by the shape of your earlobe, and I think it's just outside the scope of this video. But I would work on that in the future for a follow-up video if there's interest in it. Okay, so final thoughts. Put everything together and you have this experience that's kind of variable from person to person, but does appear to offer some benefit, especially for anxiety and as a sleep aid. It can also be used as a teaching tool for how the auditory system works. Wink. I'm thinking about making this kind of a subtle auditory signature for my videos moving forward with a binaural beat added on top of the background music that I've selected for each video. And I also just think that it's kind of neat, which is worthy in and of itself from time to time. So give it a try for yourself, and let me know how it works for you. As far as my binaural beats generator code goes, I've put it up on GitHub for anybody to peruse. Maybe I should turn this into some kind of an app. Any interest out there for that? I genuinely never considered doing things like coding a mobile app in the past, but thanks to coding assistant tools out there now, the potential horizon for my possible coding projects has really widened for me dramatically, and I'm able to pursue these kinds of projects much further than I used to. If you're still watching at this point, thank you so much for your time. This is the kind of long-form content that this channel was really meant for, and the growth that I'm already starting to see between this and the podcast content is really exciting for me. If you like this kind of content that features real deep dives into biology and neuroscience and includes data-inspired stories and animations made by me, a solo and independent scientist trying to forge a novel path forward in my career, please drop me a like, a comment, or hit the subscribe button to see more of this in the future. Okay, thanks, bye.